In the last decade of the Cold War, when American stealth fighters were slipping past Soviet radar and NASA was putting reusable ships into orbit, three brothers in a divided city decided to write their own flight plan to freedom. They were not test pilots or engineers from California or Texas. They were sons of East Berlin, raised under the red flag, who turned Western-style improvisation and aviation into a weapon against the most fortified border on Earth. Their name was Betke, and their story feels like something that should have been filmed in Hollywood long before it ever appeared on a History Channel. One brother crossed a mined river on an inflatable mattress. Another turned a steel cable into a homemade zipline and simply slid over the Berlin Wall. And the youngest, Egbert, waited in the dark of a Soviet War memorial park as two tiny ultralight planes, painted like Soviet trainers, dropped out of the night sky to pick him up and carry him to the West. Picture this. It is the early hours of May 26, 1989. East Berlin is asleep under the dull orange glow of Soviet-style streetlights. On one side of the city, guards stand in concrete towers watching over the death strip that circles West Berlin. On the other side, in West Berlin, in a darkened sports field called Britzergarten, two brothers in camouflage jackets with red Soviet stars on their helmets are bolting together the wings of ultralight aircraft that are technically not even allowed to take off inside the city. And somewhere in between, in Treptower Park, on the communist side of the wall, 29-year-old Egbert Betke crouches in a bush, listening to his own heartbeat and wondering if he will hear engines coming from the wrong side of the Iron Curtain. If the plan works, in less than half an hour he will be a free man. If it fails, he will be a traitor, a prisoner, maybe a corpse in the grass. To feel what these brothers did, you have to understand the world they grew up in. Berlin was not just a city, it was a battlefield frozen in time. After World War II, the Allies divided Germany and Berlin into sectors, and by 1961, the East German regime, backed by Moscow, surrounded West Berlin with concrete, barbed wire, tripwires, mines, and an order written in cold, bureaucratic language: shoot to kill anyone trying to escape. East Germany liked to show rockets in parades, jets on flybys, and cosmonauts smiling from posters. But for ordinary people, the technology that mattered most was pointed inward, not outward. Listening devices, border sensors, electric fences, and a wall designed to keep its own citizens from ever leaving. Across the ocean, Americans watched this standoff as a test of systems, freedom and markets versus central planning and dictatorship, and they responded with Silicon Valley microchips, reconnaissance satellites, stealth bombers, and the space shuttle, every innovation another signal to the world that the free side was pulling ahead. Somewhere inside that contest of superpowers, three boys in a gray socialist neighborhood of East Berlin started dreaming about the West. Ingo, the oldest, Holger, the middle brother, and Egbert, the youngest, grew up in Adlershof, a district in the southeast of Berlin, in a family that actually had ties to the ruling system. Their parents were high-ranking party members, which gave the family a little security, but also made escape seem unthinkable, at least on paper. As a young man, Ingo was trusted enough to be sent to do his mandatory military service right on the inner German border between Lenzen and Domitz. He saw up close what that border really was, not just a line on a map, but layered fences, raked sand to show footprints, and fields seeded with mines designed to tear a human body apart before it ever reached the water. And yet, instead of convincing him to stay, that experience taught him exactly how the system worked and where its weak spots might be. By 1975, Ingo had decided that living his whole life behind a wall built by his own government was no life at all. On the night of May 26th, he and a friend drove toward the border, carrying not weapons, not high-tech gear, but something that would have looked ridiculous in an American sporting goods store, a common inflatable air mattress. They cut a hole in the fence, slid into the restricted zone, and began what might have been the most nerve-wracking walk of their lives. Ahead of them lay about 500 meters of mined ground and raked sand. To cross it, they used a simple wooden block as a low-tech mine detector, pressing it ahead of their boots, step by step, waiting to feel resistance, to hear the sickening click that never came. Every crunch of dirt sounded like an alarm. Every distant engine could have been a patrol. But they made it to the banks of the Elbe River alive. There, under a cover of fog thick enough to hide them from police boats and searchlights, they inflated the mattress, climbed on, and paddled in silence across about 200 meters of dark water to the west. 30 minutes later, they pulled themselves onto the far shore and into West Germany, exhausted, soaked, but free. In a world where superpowers measured success in megatons and Mach numbers, one East German soldier had just used camping gear to outsmart an entire border system. From his new life in the West, Ingo kept in contact with his family, using fake return addresses and cryptic phone calls, always one step ahead of the secret police. Back in East Berlin, his younger brothers were living with the consequences of his escape. The regime punished families of defectors, parents lost jobs, and the remaining children were watched more closely than ever. Helger, in particular, knew that the longer he stayed, the tighter the net around him would become. 8 years later, in 1983, on his 30th birthday, Holger decided that staying was no longer an option. But by then, the wall in Berlin had evolved into an almost laboratory-grade system of control. Double fences, patrols, floodlights, and the infamous death strip of bare sand and raked soil separating east and west. If he tried to run at ground level, he would almost certainly die. So the brothers looked not at the ground, but at the air between two buildings. From Ingo's side in west and Holger's side in east, they found two structures facing each other across the wall. A house in Schmallerstrasse in East Berlin, and a building on the western side. The idea they came up with belonged to an American stunt show. They were going to fire an arrow over the wall, use the fishing line attached to that arrow to pull a steel cable across, tighten it with a car, and then ride the cable to freedom like a human payload on an improvised zipline. Holger prepared himself by training in parks, pretending to be a circus performer, practicing balance and the feel of a pulley under his hands. Ingo, in the West, smuggled in a child's walkie-talkie so that on the night of the escape, the two could coordinate in real time. Everything about the plan spoke the language of Western problem-solving, cheap electronics, improvised hardware, and a willingness to turn a physics problem into a way out. On March 31, 1983, Holger climbed into the attic of the East Berlin house dressed as an electrician, carrying a bow, an arrow, and a line of fishing cord. He opened a small window, looked out across the darkness, and aimed for a point above the wall where he knew Ingo would be waiting. After 2 failed shots, the arrow finally sailed over the concrete and landed where it needed to land. On the western side, Ingo grabbed the line and began pulling the heavier steel cable across. He fixed his end of the cable to the back of his car and slowly drove forward, tensioning the line until it was tight. Holger anchored his end to a chimney in the attic and then clipped on a homemade pulley frame with 2 handholds and a wrist strap. One deep breath later, he stepped out into the open air, suspended above the wall and the death strip, and let gravity do the rest. With only the soft whir of the pulley, he slid out of East Berlin and into the west, landing on a balcony where Ingo caught him. In that moment, they had done something the wall was never designed to stop. It could stop feet, it could stop cars, it could even stop tanks, but it had never been designed to stop a single man hanging from a cable, riding a homemade zipline like a Cold War tightrope walker. Now, 2 Bethke brothers were free. The youngest, Egbert, was not. If being a brother of one defector had made Egbert suspicious in the eyes of the regime, being the brother of 2 made him radioactive. Stasi officers shadowed him. He knew that his phone calls could be monitored, his mail opened, his conversations reported. At one point, East German authorities even offered him a deal. He could be allowed to leave for the West, but only if he agreed to work as a spy for them once he got there. Egbert said no. In a system built on obedience and fear, refusing that kind of offer was an act of quiet rebellion. It could have cost him his future or his freedom, but it also told his brothers something very simple. If they were going to get the family back together, they could not rely on negotiating with the regime. They had to outthink it again. Somewhere in West Germany, in those years between Holger's escape and 1989, the idea that would eventually bring Egbert out of East Berlin began as something almost absurd. According to later accounts, Ingo saw a picture of a tiny one-man helicopter in a magazine, reportedly a copy of Playboy, and became fascinated with the idea of a personal aircraft that could just hop over the wall. When he went to see the prototype, however, it turned out to be more of a concept than a realistic machine for what they had in mind. Then, fate put 2 French pilots in their path, who told them about a different kind of aircraft, ultralights. These were not jets, not even fully enclosed airplanes. They were flying frames, lightweight, simple machines that combined a small engine, fabric wings, and a couple of side-by-side seats. Ultralights were at the heart of a kind of flying culture the Soviet system could never really understand. Ordinary people tinkering with their own planes, flying out of small fields, seeing the sky as a personal playground instead of a military theater. The brothers went to France and tested one. The moment Ingo felt how quickly it could get off the ground, how short a strip it needed, and how light it was, his mind started to map that feeling onto a very specific place, the parks and open spaces of East Berlin. What if they could fly not over some remote border, but straight into the city, land in a park near a Soviet war memorial, pick up Egbert, and then pop back over the wall before anyone in a command bunker had a chance to sign a piece of paper authorizing a shot? The aircraft they settled on was the Icarus C-22, a German 2-seat ultralight with about a 10-meter wingspan, aluminum tube structure, fabric wings, and small wheels. It looked less like an airliner and more like a powered lawn chair with wings, but its simplicity was its strength. It could be taken apart and hauled in a trailer, assembled in a field, and flown off grass with very little runway. There was only one problem. In West Berlin at the time, recreational flying was forbidden. This was a city ringed by Soviet forces and watched by Allied troops. You did not just buzz around in private planes for fun. So, if the Bethke brothers wanted to use ultralights inside West Berlin, they would have to sneak the aircraft in, assemble them somewhere discreet, and take off without anyone in authority noticing until it was too late. They sold the pub they had been running in Cologne to finance the purchase of 2 Icarus C-22s and everything that went with them. For 4 years they prepared. They taught themselves to fly, they practiced assembling and disassembling the craft quickly, and they studied maps of Berlin to find a route that would keep them low, fast, and hard to hit. But the real genius of the plan was not just in the aircraft, it was in the paint. The brothers understood something that every American Cold War planner also understood. The Soviet system was powerful, but it was slow. Nothing important could happen without going up and down a chain of command, especially when it came to shooting at something in the sky. Along the inner German border, East German soldiers of the National People's Army, the NVA, couldn't simply open fire on an aircraft just because they saw it. They needed Soviet approval. That meant a guard had to report a sighting to an officer, the officer had to call a higher headquarters, the headquarters then had to contact Soviet commanders, and only when everyone was satisfied that the aircraft was not one of theirs could the order be given to shoot. The Bethkes decided to weaponize that bureaucracy. They painted their ultralights in camouflage green and glued large red Soviet-style stars on the wings and even on their helmets and jackets. From a distance, in the pre-dawn light, a nervous conscript looking up from a border tower would see what looked like Soviet training planes making a low-level run over Berlin. Was it a drill? Was it a mistake? Was it something the Soviets had forgotten to mention? If that guard hesitated for even a minute, the brothers might already be gone. Their first attempt came on May 11, 1989, and it failed. The details are still hazy in the public record. Some sources hint at weather problems, others at technical issues or a risk they chose not to take. What matters is that they did something un-Soviet. They treated failure as data, not as dishonor. They went home, adjusted the plan, and waited for another window. That window opened 2 weeks later. On May 25, 1989, Ingo and Holger loaded their disassembled ultralights onto trailers and drove them into West Berlin under the cover of darkness. Their destination was Britzer Garden, a park with a sports field big enough to serve as a makeshift runway. Around midnight, they began to assemble the aircraft, wings out of bags, struts locked into place, control linkages checked and double-checked. Meanwhile, on the other side of the wall, Egbert received a coded message. Ulrike is doing well. To anyone listening, it was just a harmless sentence. To the brothers, it meant, tonight is the night. Get ready. Egbert walked through East Berlin streets that he knew might be watched, heading for Treptower Park, home to a massive Soviet war memorial with towering statues and carefully groomed paths. He found a cluster of bushes near an open area that could serve as an improvised landing strip and hid himself among the leaves, trying not to shake every time a patrol car drove by. He checked his watch. 4 o'clock was getting closer. Back in Britzer Garden, as the sky stayed dark and the city slept, the 2 ultralights were ready. The brothers wore their camouflage jackets and helmets marked with red stars, looking less like private citizens and more like some strange hybrid of Soviet trainee and weekend pilot. They strapped in, ran through a last quick checklist, and opened the throttles. The Rotax engines roared to life, small but insistent, and the aircraft began to roll across the grass. In a matter of seconds, their lightweight frames lifted into the air, and the 2 planes climbed into the Berlin night, heading for the dangerous glow of the eastern horizon. One would be the Spear, landing to pick up Egbert. The other would be the Shield, circling overhead to watch for trouble. They flew low, just a couple hundred meters above the ground, following the snake of the Berlin Wall as it cut through the city. Below them, watchtowers and fences slid by, but there were no searchlights swinging up, no tracer rounds reaching for them. The border guards were either asleep at their scopes or staring at 2 camouflaged aircraft with red stars and thinking, this has to be Soviet business. Shooting by mistake at your own air force was not a career move any East German officer wanted to make. In the lead plane, Ingo held the controls with the same tight focus he had felt 14 years earlier as he pushed a wooden block through a minefield. He knew there were radar sites in the area, but he also knew that small, slow ultralights hugging the ground were hard to distinguish from noise. Beside him sat an empty seat, waiting for a brother he hadn't seen since the mid-1970s. They reached Treptower Park. Holger pulled up and began to circle above the area, scanning the ground for movement. Ingo eased back the throttle and began his descent. For anyone strolling the park at that hour, not that anyone was supposed to be there, it would have been one of the strangest sights of the entire Cold War, a tiny camouflaged plane with Soviet stars on its wings dropping into a city park in the heart of East Berlin. Egbert heard the engine before he saw the plane. The sound grew from a distant hum into a sharp, insistent buzz, then exploded into the clearing as the ultralight flared and its small wheels touched grass. He burst out of his hiding place and sprinted toward it, heart pounding so hard he could barely hear anything else. The aircraft rolled, turned, lined up for takeoff. As it straightened, Egbert reached it, grabbed the frame, and swung himself into the seat beside the pilot. For a fraction of a second, their eyes met. 2 brothers separated for 14 years by a wall and a system that had tried to turn them into different people. There was no time for words. Ingo shoved a helmet into Egbert's hands, pushed the throttle forward, and the ultralight began to race across the grass. Behind them, in some watchtower or barracks, a guard might have been picking up a phone, stammering an excited report about strange planes near the Soviet memorial. An officer might have been rolling out of bed, rubbing his eyes, wondering if the Soviets had scheduled some kind of exercise without telling anyone. By the time those questions reached a Soviet duty officer, the ultralights would already be climbing back over the wall. In a maneuver that now sounds almost casual in the retelling, but in reality was a razor's edge of risk, the two ultralights, now with all three Bethke brothers aboard, two in one plane, one in the other, flew low back across the border and made for the symbolic heart of West Berlin. They came down not at an official airport, not at a military base, but in front of the old Reichstag building, the former German parliament, which at that time stood more as a monument than a seat of power. The planes touched down, rolled to a stop on the grass. The brothers unstrapped, jumped out, and within moments had left the machines behind and disappeared into the west to celebrate what they had just done. From first takeoff to final landing, the entire operation had taken less than 20 minutes. It was over before the system they were defying had even fully realized what had happened. 6 months later, in November 1989, the Berlin Wall began to fall. Crowds with hammers and bare hands did in a few nights what governments and tank divisions had not managed in nearly 3 decades. People poured through checkpoints that had once been kill zones, and somewhere in the swirl of that history, the story of 3 brothers and their mattress, their zipline, and their ultralights became one more reminder that the wall had been crumbling from the inside long before it cracked on television. By 1994, Ingo and Egbert had actually moved back to Adlershof, the neighborhood of their childhood, now part of a united Berlin in a united Germany. They walked streets that had once been patrolled by men with guns and dogs, now lined with shops selling Western goods and kids carrying backpacks instead of party flags. The system that had forced them to risk their lives just to cross a river, a street, or a park no longer existed. So what does this story mean when you watch it from across the Atlantic as an American decades later? Part of the answer lies in the contrast between 2 ways of thinking about technology and power. On one side of the Cold War, the state owned the sky, the factories, the planes, and the narrative. On the other side, people in garages, hangars, and small fields treated technology as something personal, flexible, and creative. The Bethke brothers didn't win a dogfight against Soviet MiGs. They never flew an F-16, an SR-71, or a B-2. But they were part of the same mindset that produced those aircraft, a belief that you could look at a problem, even one as brutal as the Berlin Wall, and say, there has to be a better way. They borrowed a page from the same playbook that let American engineers turn aluminum and jet fuel into an aircraft that could fly from New York to London in a few hours, or slip into Soviet airspace unseen. Ingo's wooden block mine detector, his inflatable mattress, Holger's zipline, and their ultralight Soviet trainers were all expressions of that idea on a human scale. They were the Cold War translated from geopolitics down into the lives of 3 brothers who refused to accept the border they were given. What the Soviet system had in tanks and parades, it lacked in adaptability. What the free world had, and still has, is the stubborn, sometimes reckless creativity of individuals willing to try something insane because staying put feels worse. If you grew up hearing about American air power in World War II, B-17s over Europe, carrier groups in the Pacific, you know that sense of awe when you see black and white footage of American technology overwhelming a dictatorship that thought it could bully the world. The Cold War never turned into that kind of open conflict in Europe, but there was a quieter kind of victory, measured not in destroyed bridges, but in people who slipped across borders because Western ideas and tools gave them options. The Bethke story hits that same emotional chord. It is a reminder that in the shadow of Soviet monuments, in a park dedicated to Red Army dead, Western-made engines and a do-it-yourself flying culture reached in and pulled someone out. It shows how even the most intimidating wall can be vulnerable, not just to missiles or tanks, but to a pair of brothers with the courage to bet their lives on a different way of thinking.
When you watch this story from an American living room, it is easy to feel pride in the side of the Cold War that inspired rather than imprisoned, that built technologies meant not just to intimidate rivals, but to give ordinary people more freedom of movement, more options, more sky. It is easy to feel fascination at the image of two ultralight aircraft, tiny against the night, dancing around Soviet rules as if those rules were just another obstacle on a flight plan. And it is hard not to feel curiosity about how many other escapes, how many other acts of courage and ingenuity never made it to the front page, but helped wear down the confidence of a system that thought it could stop history with concrete. In the end, the Bethke brothers did what the best stories of World War II and the Cold War always show. Dictators build walls, but free minds learn to fly over them, sometimes with bombers and jets and spacecraft, sometimes with nothing more than an air mattress, a steel cable, and an ultralight painted with the wrong flag.